At 2 a.m. on October 26, 1942, Platoon Sergeant Mitchell Page crouched behind a Browning M1917 water-cooled machine gun on a rain-soaked ridge above Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, watching assembly lights flicker through the jungle 300 yards south. 24 years old, 6 years as a machine gunner, 33 men under his command. The Japanese 17th Army had sent roughly 2,700 soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Division to retake Henderson Field. The Marines had captured the airfield 2 months earlier, and the Japanese wanted it back. Without Henderson Field, American bombers couldn't reach Japanese supply lines. Without those bombers, Japan controlled the Pacific. Page had positioned 4 Browning M1917 machine guns along a 1,500-yard ridge south of the airfield. Each gun weighed 93 pounds without water and ammunition. Each gun could fire 450 rounds per minute. Each gun needed 3 men to operate effectively. Page had trained every Marine in his platoon to field strip the M1917 blindfolded. They could disassemble the gun, clean it, and reassemble it in darkness. They could clear jams by touch alone. They had drilled this procedure hundreds of times because Page knew that in combat, there would be no time for mistakes. The ridge Page defended was the weakest point in the American defensive perimeter. If the Japanese broke through here, they would reach Henderson Field in 20 minutes. If they reached Henderson Field, they would destroy every American bomber, fighter, and transport plane on the island. The Marines would lose Guadalcanal. The Japanese would control the supply corridor between the United States and Australia. Everything depended on this ridge. Page had rigged a makeshift tripwire in front of his position earlier that evening. He had strung the wire through the jungle undergrowth and placed empty C-ration cans at intervals along the wire. Each can contained an empty cartridge. If Japanese soldiers disturbed the wire, the cans would rattle. The system was crude, but effective. It would give his men perhaps 30 seconds of warning before the attack began. At 2:45 a.m., the cans rattled. Japanese artillery from howitzers positioned west of the Matanikaw River began hammering the ridge. Shells exploded in the mud around Page's position. Tree branches shattered overhead. Shrapnel tore through the jungle canopy. The rain turned the ground into thick mud that made movement difficult. Page could hear Japanese soldiers moving through the jungle below. They were singing. They were smoking cigarettes. They were confident they would retake Henderson Field before dawn. The first wave of Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle at 3 a.m. Page gave the order to open fire. 4 Browning M1917s opened up simultaneously. Tracers cut through the darkness like red streaks. Japanese soldiers fell in rows. The first ranks collapsed. The second ranks climbed over them. The Marines had zeroed their guns during the afternoon. They knew the exact range to every tree, every bush, every depression in the ground. The Japanese were advancing directly into a kill zone that Page had prepared for exactly this moment. But the Japanese kept coming. They climbed over their own dead. They charged through machine gun fire without stopping. Page could see officers with samurai swords leading attacks. He could see soldiers carrying Bangalore torpedoes to blow holes in the barbed wire. He could see hundreds more moving through the trees behind the first wave. The sheer weight of numbers was overwhelming. For every Japanese soldier who fell, 2 more appeared from the jungle. By 4 a.m., 2 of Page's 4 guns had been knocked out. Japanese grenades had killed the crews. Blood mixed with rainwater in the gun pits. Page shifted his remaining men to the 2 functional guns. He moved along the ridge through the mud, directing fire, clearing jams, replacing wounded gunners. A Japanese soldier lunged at him with a bayonet. The blade cut deep into Page's left hand, nearly severing his fingers. Page drove his K-bar knife into the attacker's neck and kept moving. By 5 a.m., only 1 gun was still firing. By 5:30, Page looked left and right along his position. Every Marine in his platoon was either dead or wounded. 32 men. He was alone. If you want to see how Page held this position alone against 2,700 Japanese soldiers, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Page. The Japanese were regrouping for another assault. Page could hear officers shouting orders in the darkness. He could hear hundreds of boots moving through the mud. He had 1 functional machine gun. He had perhaps 2,000 rounds of ammunition remaining. He had 10 hours until dawn and reinforcements. Page grabbed the Browning M1917. The barrel was glowing red from continuous fire. The water jacket was nearly empty. He had no crew to help him. He would have to feed the belt, fire the gun, and clear jams entirely alone. And the Japanese were coming again. The Browning M1917 machine gun required 3 men to operate at maximum efficiency. 1 man fired the gun and adjusted aim. 1 man fed the ammunition belt and cleared jams. 1 man carried spare ammunition and water for the cooling jacket. The gun fired from a cloth belt holding 250 rounds. Each belt lasted 33 seconds of continuous fire. When the belt ran empty, someone had to load a new belt while the gunner maintained his position. When the water jacket overheated, someone had to refill it, or the barrel would warp and the gun would jam permanently. Page had no one. He was the gunner, the loader, and the ammunition carrier. He would fire until the belt ran empty, then reload while Japanese soldiers advanced through the darkness. He would fire again until the water jacket began to steam, then crawl to find water while the barrel cooled. The system was impossible. He tried it anyway. The next Japanese wave hit at 6 a.m. Page opened fire. The gun bucked against his shoulder. Spent casings piled up around his position. Tracers showed him where the rounds were going. He could see Japanese soldiers falling 50 yards away. He could see more climbing over the bodies. The belt ran empty after 30 seconds. He grabbed a new belt with his right hand. His left hand was still bleeding from the bayonet wound. He loaded the belt into the feed tray with one hand while watching the Japanese advance. 20 yards, 15 yards. He slammed the feed cover closed and opened fire again. The Japanese fell back. By 7 a.m., the barrel was too hot to touch. Steam poured from the water jacket. Page knew the gun would seize if he kept firing. He grabbed an empty canteen and crawled 15 feet to where a dead Marine lay in the mud. The Marine had a full canteen. Page unscrewed it and poured water into the gun's jacket. The water boiled instantly. He poured more. The gun cooled enough to keep firing. At 8 a.m., his original gun jammed. A spent casing had lodged in the receiver. Page cleared it by feel in the darkness, but the gun jammed again 3 belts later. The receiver was damaged. The gun was finished. He abandoned it and crawled 30 yards through mud and bodies to where the second gun sat silent. The crew was dead. The gun was intact. He dragged the gun back to his position. 250 rounds remained in the belt. The Japanese hit again at 9 a.m. Page fired from the second gun. The barrel was cold. The water jacket was full. The gun worked perfectly. He killed Japanese soldiers at 40 yards, at 30 yards, at 20 yards. They kept coming. He could smell them now. Sweat and gun smoke and blood. He could hear their boots in the mud. He could hear officers shouting. The belt ran empty. He reloaded. The Japanese fell back again. Page's hands were shaking. Blood from his bayonet wound had soaked his left sleeve. Shrapnel from a grenade had hit his right leg. He could barely see through the darkness and smoke. His ears were ringing from hours of machine gun fire. He had lost track of how many belts he had fired. He had lost track of how many Japanese soldiers he had killed. He only knew they kept attacking and he kept firing. At 10 a.m., the second gun overheated. Page crawled to find water. Every canteen within reach was empty. The dead Marines had already been stripped of water hours ago. He remembered something from training, something desperate. He urinated into the water jacket. The gun cooled. He kept firing. By 11 a.m., Page had been fighting alone for 6 hours. The sun was rising. He could see the battlefield clearly now. Bodies covered the slope in front of his position. Hundreds of them. The Japanese had pulled back to regroup. Page used the pause to crawl to the third gun position. That crew was dead too. He dragged their ammunition back to his position. 12 belts, 3,000 rounds. He checked his remaining guns. Gun 2 was still functional, but the barrel was worn. Gun 3 had a damaged tripod, but the weapon itself worked. Gun 4 had been destroyed by a grenade. He now had 2 functional guns and 3,000 rounds. The Japanese had at least 2,000 soldiers left, and they were forming up for another assault. Page saw them gathering in the tree line 400 yards south. Officers were organizing units. Soldiers were fixing bayonets. This would be the big push. They would throw everything at his position. And if Page's guns failed, if he ran out of ammunition, If he made one mistake, Henderson Field would fall before noon. The Japanese assault began at noon. This time they came from 3 directions simultaneously. 200 soldiers charged directly up the slope toward Page's position. Another 100 flanked left through the jungle. Another 100 flanked right. They were trying to overwhelm him through sheer numbers. They were trying to force him to choose which direction to defend while the other attacks succeeded. Page chose all 3 directions. He fired gun 2 at the center assault until the belt ran empty. While the Japanese in the center took cover, he grabbed gun 3 and fired at the left flank. 30-second bursts. He killed the lead elements and forced them back. Then he dropped gun 3 and returned to gun 2 with a fresh belt. The center assault had resumed. He fired again. The Japanese fell back. He switched to gun 3 for the right flank. He was moving between guns every 30 seconds, firing from different positions, making the Japanese think multiple machine gunners were defending the ridge. The deception worked for 20 minutes. Then the Japanese officers realized only one gun was firing at a time. They adjusted their tactics. They began coordinating their assaults so all 3 attacks hit simultaneously. Page could only fire 1 gun. That meant 2 attacks would advance unopposed while he engaged the third. At 12:30 p.m., the right flank broke through. Japanese soldiers reached the top of the ridge 70 yards from Page's position. They were setting up a knee mortar. If that mortar started firing, Page would be finished. He grabbed gun 3 and traversed right. He fired a full belt into the mortar team. They went down. But while he was firing right, the center assault had advanced to 30 yards. He swung gun 3 back to center and fired. The Japanese dove for cover. Page was losing. He could hold one position or another, but not both. The Japanese would eventually flank him and attack from behind. He needed help. He needed reinforcements. He needed anything. At 1 p.m., he heard American voices behind him. 2 rifle companies from the Battalion Reserve were moving up the ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Puller was leading them personally. Puller had brought 40 Marines to reinforce Page's position. They spread out along the ridge and began firing. The Japanese advance stalled. Puller crawled up to Page's position. He looked at the dead Marines. He looked at the hundreds of Japanese bodies on the slope. He looked at Page covered in blood and mud, still firing the machine gun. Puller asked if Page could hold until more reinforcements arrived. Page said he could hold as long as he had ammunition. The Marines dug in. Puller organized the defense. He positioned riflemen to cover the flanks. He brought up 2 more machine guns to support Page's position. He called for artillery support from the batteries behind Henderson Field. Within 30 minutes, American 105mm howitzers were dropping shells on the Japanese assembly areas 400 yards south. The Japanese advance stopped, but Page knew this was temporary. The Japanese still outnumbered the Americans 10-1. They still had fresh troops in the jungle. They would attack again, and when they did, Page would be right back where he started, alone behind a machine gun, fighting impossible odds. At 2 p.m., the Japanese began another assault. This time, they sent 500 soldiers straight up the middle. No flanking attacks, no tactics, just mass. They were betting that sheer numbers would overwhelm the American position. They were probably right. The howitzers fired. Shells exploded in the Japanese ranks. Dozens fell. Hundreds kept coming. The Marine riflemen opened fire. More Japanese fell. More kept coming. They were within 50 yards now. Puller was yelling for everyone to hold their positions. Page was firing belt after belt into the advancing mass. At 40 yards, Page's gun jammed. A spent casing had stuck in the ejection port. He cleared it with his K-bar knife. The Japanese were at 30 yards. He loaded a fresh belt and fired. The gun worked for 10 seconds, then jammed again. The receiver was damaged from hours of continuous fire. The gun was finished. Page looked at Puller. They both knew what came next. If the Japanese reached the ridge, they would overrun the position in hand-to-hand combat. The Marines would lose Henderson Field. The Americans would lose Guadalcanal. Everything they had fought for over the past 2 months would be gone. Puller made a decision. He ordered everyone to fix bayonets. They were going to charge. 40 Marines were going to charge downhill into 500 Japanese soldiers. It was suicide. Puller asked who would lead the charge. Page stood up. He had been fighting for 12 hours straight. He had held this ridge alone for 6 of those hours. He had killed more Japanese soldiers than he could count. His hands were destroyed. His leg was bleeding. He could barely stand. But he was not done fighting. He picked up his M1903 Springfield rifle. He fixed his bayonet, and he looked at the Japanese soldiers climbing the slope toward him. The bayonet charge began at 2:15 p.m. Page went first. 40 Marines followed. They ran downhill through the mud toward 500 Japanese soldiers climbing up. The Japanese saw them coming and hesitated. They had been attacking for 12 hours. They had lost hundreds of men. They had thrown wave after wave at this ridge, and every wave had been cut down by machine gun fire. Now, the Americans were charging them. The hesitation lasted 3 seconds. Then the Japanese officers started yelling orders, and the soldiers raised their rifles. 500 rifles against 41 Marines running downhill with bayonets. The mathematics were simple. The Marines would die before they covered 30 yards. But something strange happened. The Japanese soldiers in the front ranks looked at the Marines charging toward them, and looked at the hundreds of dead Japanese soldiers covering the slope behind them, and made a calculation. They had been attacking this position since 3 a.m., 11 hours. They had sent wave after wave, and every wave had been destroyed. Now the Marines who had killed all those men were charging directly at them with bayonets. The front ranks broke and ran. The officers tried to stop them. They drew their swords and screamed at the soldiers to hold their positions. Some soldiers obeyed. Most did not. The entire front line of the Japanese assault collapsed. Men turned and ran back down the slope. The Marines kept charging. Page hit the Japanese line at a full run. He drove his bayonet into the first soldier he reached. The blade went through the man's chest and stuck. Page couldn't pull it free. He dropped the rifle and drew his K-bar knife. A Japanese soldier swung his rifle at Page's head. Page blocked with his left arm and drove the knife into the soldier's stomach. Another soldier came at him from the right. Page kicked him in the knee and stabbed downward as the man fell. The Marines spread out along the slope. They were killing Japanese soldiers in close combat. Bayonets and knives and rifle butts. The Japanese line broke completely. Soldiers were running back toward the jungle. Officers were trying to rally them, but the panic had spread. Within 5 minutes, the entire assault had dissolved into a rout. Page chased them 50 yards down the slope. Then Puller was yelling for everyone to pull back to the ridge. They had broken the assault, but they were still outnumbered. If they chased too far, the Japanese would regroup and surround them. The Marines fell back to their original positions. Page collapsed behind his gun. His hands were shaking so badly he could not hold his rifle. His left hand was barely functional from the bayonet wound. Blood had soaked through both sleeves and one pant leg. He had not eaten since the previous evening. He had not slept in 36 hours. He had been fighting for 13 hours straight. His body was shutting down. Puller brought water. Page drank. A corpsman came up and tried to bandage his hand. Page waved him away. The hand could wait. The Japanese were still out there. They would attack again. They always attacked again. But the attack did not come. At 3 p.m., the ridge was silent. At 4 p.m., still nothing. Marine patrols moved forward carefully through the battlefield. They counted bodies. Japanese dead covered the slope from the ridgeline down to the jungle. The patrols counted 473 bodies in front of Page's original position alone. 473 Japanese soldiers had died trying to break through his section of the ridge. At 5 p.m., battalion headquarters sent word. The Japanese were withdrawing. The battle for Henderson Field was over. The Americans had held. Henderson Field was secure. The Guadalcanal campaign would continue. Page sat behind his gun and stared at the jungle. He had held this ridge for 15 hours. He had fought alone for 6 of those hours. He had fired thousands of rounds. He had killed more Japanese soldiers than he could count. His platoon was gone. 32 Marines dead or wounded. He was the only one left. Someone from regimental headquarters arrived at 6 p.m. They were collecting after-action reports. They asked Page what had happened. He told them. 1 platoon sergeant, 33 Marines, 4 machine guns, 2,700 Japanese soldiers. The headquarters officer wrote it down. Then he asked how many Japanese soldiers Page thought he had killed personally. Page said he did not know. He had stopped counting after the first 100. The officer wrote that down, too. At 7 p.m., as the sun set over Guadalcanal, Page finally allowed the corpsman to bandage his hand. The bayonet had cut through tendons and nearly severed 2 fingers. The corpsman said Page needed surgery. Page said the hand could wait. He needed to help bury his Marines first. On October 27th, the day after the battle, Colonel Puller recommended Page for the Medal of Honor. On December 19th, 1942, Page was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the field. On May 21st, 1943, Marine Corps Commandant General Alexander Vandergrift presented Page with the Medal of Honor in Melbourne, Australia. Page put the medal in a cigar box and mailed it home to his parents. Then he returned to combat. He fought at Cape Gloucester, he fought in New Guinea, he stayed in the Pacific Theater until July 1944. He never spoke about Guadalcanal, unless someone asked directly. Years later, historians tried to determine exactly how many Japanese soldiers Page had killed during those 6 hours he fought alone. They examined the battlefield reports. They studied the Japanese unit records. They calculated fields of fire and ammunition expenditure. The most conservative estimate was 140 Japanese soldiers killed by Page personally during those 6 hours. The Browning M1917 machine gun that Page used was designed in 1917 by John Moses Browning. The weapon fired 30 caliber rounds from a cloth belt at a cyclic rate of 450 rounds per minute. The barrel was surrounded by a water-filled cooling jacket that prevented overheating during sustained fire. Without water in the jacket, the barrel would glow red after 200 rounds and warp after 500 rounds. With water, the gun could fire continuously for hours. The gun weighed 93 pounds fully loaded. The tripod weighed 53 pounds. A full ammunition can weighed 22 pounds and contained 250 rounds. To move a single gun required 3 men minimum. To operate it effectively in combat required constant coordination between the gunner, the loader, and the ammunition bearer. The loader had to feed the belt smoothly into the receiver while the gunner maintained aim. If the belt twisted or caught, the gun would jam. If the loader fed too fast or too slow, the rhythm broke and accuracy suffered. Page had operated this gun for 6 years before Guadalcanal. He had fired tens of thousands of rounds in training. He knew exactly how the weapon behaved under different conditions. He knew how the belt fed when wet from rain. He knew how the gun pulled left when the barrel heated. He knew the precise moment when the water jacket needed refilling. He knew these things instinctively because he had trained until the gun became an extension of his own body. Most machine gunners in 1942 had 6 months of training. Page had 72 months. Most gunners had fired perhaps 5,000 training rounds before combat. Page had fired 10 times that amount. Most gunners understood the mechanical operation of the weapon. Page understood the soul of it. He could hear when a jam was starting before it happened. He could feel when the barrel was beginning to overheat before the water boiled. He could sense when the ammunition belt was about to catch before the gun stopped firing. This expertise explains how Page survived the first 2 hours alone. Training and experience kept his guns running when they should have failed. But training does not explain how he survived 6 hours. Training does not explain how he moved between multiple gun positions while under fire. Training does not explain how he reloaded belts with a bayonet wound through his left hand. Training does not explain how he kept fighting when his body should have collapsed from exhaustion. The human body has limits. Medical studies conducted after World War II analyzed the physical demands of sustained combat. Researchers found that soldiers could maintain peak performance for approximately 2 hours under high stress. After 2 hours, fine motor skills began to deteriorate. After 4 hours, decision-making ability declined sharply. After 6 hours, most soldiers experienced complete physical and mental exhaustion. Page fought alone for 6 hours. He maintained fine motor skills sufficient to clear gun jams in darkness. He made tactical decisions about which gun to fire and which direction to defend. He moved repeatedly between positions while carrying ammunition. He did all of this with significant wounds and no food or water. By every medical standard available, he should have collapsed after 3 hours. Some historians argue that adrenaline kept Page functioning. The human body produces adrenaline during extreme stress. Adrenaline increases heart rate, dilates blood vessels, and releases glucose for immediate energy. It enables short bursts of enhanced performance. But adrenaline effects last minutes, not hours. The body cannot maintain adrenaline production for 6 hours straight. Eventually, the system crashes and the person collapses. Other historians point to Page's training as the deciding factor. They argue that 6 years of experience created such deep muscle memory that Page could operate the guns even while exhausted. The actions became automatic. Loading, firing, clearing jams, all happened without conscious thought. This theory has merit, but does not fully explain his endurance. A third theory focuses on psychology. Page knew that if he stopped fighting, Henderson Field would fall. If Henderson Field fell, the Marines would lose Guadalcanal. If they lost Guadalcanal, Japan would control the Pacific. Page understood the strategic importance of his position. This understanding created a psychological imperative stronger than physical exhaustion. He kept fighting because stopping was not an option. Probably all three factors contributed. Adrenaline provided initial energy. Training enabled automatic responses when conscious thought became difficult. Psychology maintained determination when his body demanded rest. The combination kept him alive and fighting for 6 hours that should have killed him. But there is a fourth factor that historians rarely discuss. Page was not fighting for abstract strategic goals. He was not fighting for Henderson Field or Guadalcanal or the Pacific Campaign. He was fighting for 32 dead Marines lying in the mud around his position. His entire platoon. Men he had trained. Men he had led. Men who had trusted him to keep them alive. They were dead. He was not. And as long as he could still fire a gun, their deaths would mean something. The Japanese would not break through. The ridge would hold. Henderson Field would survive. And 32 Marines would not have died for nothing. This is what kept Mitchell Page fighting when every physical and mental system in his body was screaming for him to stop. The battle for Henderson Field lasted from October 23rd to October 26th, 1942. The Japanese committed approximately 7,000 troops from the 17th Army to the offensive. The Americans defended with roughly 3,000 Marines and soldiers. The Japanese plan called for simultaneous attacks from multiple directions to overwhelm the American perimeter. If the plan succeeded, they would recapture Henderson Field and drive the Americans off Guadalcanal entirely. The battle was divided into multiple sectors. Page defended the southern approach. Other Marine units defended the eastern and western approaches. The heaviest fighting occurred on the nights of October 24th and October 26th. Japanese forces launched coordinated assaults across the entire perimeter. Artillery bombardments preceded the infantry attacks. The goal was to break through at any weak point and exploit the gap. Page's sector was not the only position that faced overwhelming odds. On the night of October 24th, 2 nights before Page's stand, another Marine machine gun section came under similar attack. Sergeant John Basilone commanded that section. His unit was positioned northeast of Page's location, defending a different approach to Henderson Field. Basilone's position was hit by approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers from the 29th Infantry Regiment. The attack began at 9 p.m. on October 24th. Within 2 hours, Basilone's machine gun crews were running low on ammunition. Basilone made repeated trips through Japanese fire to retrieve ammunition from rear areas. He carried the ammunition belts on his shoulders, running bent over through machine gun fire and mortar explosions. He made 4 trips. Each trip brought back enough ammunition to keep his guns firing for another 30 minutes. When 2 of Basilone's guns were knocked out, he repaired them under fire. When his gunners were wounded, he took over the guns himself. He fired continuously for 15 hours. By dawn on October 25th, Barcelone's section had killed approximately 900 Japanese soldiers. The position held. Barcelone received the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Medal of Honor recipients from the same battalion in the same battle defending the same airfield against the same enemy. Barcelone on October 24th, Page on October 26th. The 2 men never met during the battle. Their positions were separated by 2 miles of jungle, but they faced the same situation: overwhelming numbers, dead crew members, failing guns, impossible odds, and they both kept fighting until reinforcements arrived. The Japanese losses during the battle for Henderson Field were catastrophic. American forces counted approximately 2,000 Japanese dead across all sectors. Another 1,000 were wounded. The Japanese 17th Army had committed 7,000 troops to the offensive. Nearly half became casualties. The units that survived were no longer combat effective. The offensive failed completely. American casualties were significantly lower, but still substantial. The Marines lost 206 killed and 346 wounded during the 4-day battle. Some companies lost 50% of their strength. Some platoons were wiped out entirely. Page's platoon suffered 97% casualties. 32 of 33 men were killed or wounded. Only Page survived, unfit for further combat that day. The strategic consequences of the battle were enormous. Henderson Field remained in American hands. American bombers continued operating from the airfield. Japanese supply lines remained vulnerable to air attack. The Japanese could not reinforce their garrison on Guadalcanal fast enough to sustain offensive operations. Within 2 months, the Japanese would begin evacuating Guadalcanal entirely. Military historians consider the battle for Henderson Field the decisive engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. Before October 26th, the outcome of the campaign was uncertain. Either side could have won. After October 26th, Japanese defeat was inevitable. The Americans had proven they could hold Henderson Field against the strongest attack the Japanese could launch. The Japanese had proven they could not retake the airfield, no matter how many troops they committed. Page's defense of the southern ridge was a small part of a larger battle, but it was a critical part. If the Japanese had broken through his sector, they would have reached Henderson Field from the south, while other units attacked from the east and west. The Americans would have faced encirclement. The defense would have collapsed. Henderson Field would have fallen. The entire Guadalcanal campaign would have failed. One platoon sergeant holding one ridge for 6 hours prevented that outcome. 32 dead Marines and 1 man who refused to stop fighting no matter what happened around him. That was the margin between American victory and Japanese success on Guadalcanal. That was how close the Pacific War came to taking a very different direction. On November 15, 2003, Mitchell Page died of congestive heart failure at his home in La Quinta, California. He was 85 years old. He had retired from the Marine Corps in 1959 with the rank of colonel. He had served for 24 years after Guadalcanal. He had never spoken publicly about the battle unless directly asked. When asked, he always said the same thing. The Medal of Honor belonged to 33 Marines, not to him. The real heroes were the men who did not come home. But there was something Page did after the war that revealed how deeply Guadalcanal had affected him. Something he dedicated the final decades of his life to accomplishing. Something that connected directly to the 32 Marines who died on that ridge. In the years after World War II, a problem emerged regarding the Medal of Honor. People began claiming they had received the award when they had not. Some did it for personal gain. They wore fake medals at public events. They claimed veteran benefits they had not earned. They told stories about heroic actions that never happened. Others did it for social status. Wearing a Medal of Honor brought respect and attention. Some people wanted that respect without earning it. This was more than simple fraud. The Medal of Honor represents something specific. It represents actions beyond normal duty. It represents soldiers who faced death and kept fighting anyway. It represents the absolute limit of human courage under the worst possible circumstances. When someone wears a fake Medal of Honor, they diminish every real recipient. They steal honor from men who actually earned it. Congress recognized this problem and made it a federal crime to falsely claim receipt of the Medal of Honor. The law carried penalties including fines and imprisonment. But enforcement was difficult. The military maintained records of Medal of Honor recipients, But those records were not always easily accessible. Local police departments did not have the resources to investigate every suspicious claim. Many fraudulent recipients continued operating for years without consequences. Mitchell Page became personally involved in stopping this fraud. After retiring from the Marine Corps in 1959, he joined the Congressional Medal of Honor Society as a liaison officer. Part of his role involved working with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to identify false recipients. When someone claimed to have received a Medal of Honor, Page would verify the claim against official records. If the claim was false, he would notify the FBI. The FBI would investigate and prosecute if sufficient evidence existed. Page took this work seriously. He investigated hundreds of cases over several decades. He traveled to public events where fake recipients appeared. He examined their medals. He asked questions about their service. He checked their stories against historical records. When he found discrepancies, he reported them. Many prosecutions resulted from his investigations. People asked why Page dedicated so much time to this work. He was a retired colonel. He could have spent his retirement relaxing. He had earned that right. But Page said the work was necessary. He said the Medal of Honor did not belong to the people who received it. It belonged to everyone who served. It belonged especially to those who did not survive. When someone wore a fake medal, they insulted every soldier who had actually faced combat. They insulted every Marine who had died in action. Page was thinking about 32 specific Marines when he said this. His platoon, the men who died on that ridge on Guadalcanal. Those Marines had trusted him. They had followed his orders. They had died defending Henderson Field. Page had survived. He had received the Medal of Honor, but he understood that the medal represented all 33 Marines, not just him. When someone wore a fake Medal of Honor, they were stealing honor from those 32 dead Marines. This was personal for Page. This was about protecting the memory of men who could not defend themselves. This was about ensuring their sacrifice maintained its meaning. This was about preventing fraudulent people from diminishing what those Marines had done on October 26, 1942. Page worked on these investigations until his health declined in his final years. He personally helped identify and prosecute dozens of fraudulent Medal of Honor claims. He protected the integrity of the award. He protected the honor of men like John Basilone, who had died at Iwo Jima in 1945. He protected the honor of the 32 Marines who died on that ridge at Guadalcanal. In 1998, toy company Hasbro created a G.I. Joe action figure based on Mitchell Page. The figure wore a Marine Corps uniform and carried a machine gun. It was part of a series honoring Medal of Honor recipients from each branch of the military. Page was selected as the Marine Corps representative. The figure came with a small booklet explaining his actions on Guadalcanal. Thousands of these figures were sold. A new generation of children learned about what happened on that ridge. In 1999, Page received a star on the Palm Springs Walk of Stars. The ceremony recognized him as one of 5 Medal of Honor recipients from the Southern California desert area. Local veterans groups attended. Page gave a brief speech. He said the star should honor all Marines who fought on Guadalcanal, not just him. He said the real heroes were buried in military cemeteries across the Pacific. A museum at Marine Corps Base 29 Palms was dedicated to Page. The museum displayed his uniform, his Medal of Honor, and artifacts from Guadalcanal. Visitors could see the type of machine gun Page had used. They could read his citation. They could learn about the battle for Henderson Field. The museum educated thousands of Marines about their history. It kept the memory of Guadalcanal alive for new generations. On March 23, 2003, 8 months before his death, Page finally received his Eagle Scout Award. He had earned the rank in 1936 at age 17, but had never received the physical award because he left home to join the Marines. The Boy Scouts of America held a ceremony 67 years later. Page was one of only 7 men to be both an Eagle Scout and a Medal of Honor recipient. When Mitchell Page died on November 15, 2003, he was the last surviving Medal of Honor recipient from the Guadalcanal campaign. John Basilone had died at Iwo Jima in February 1945. The other Guadalcanal recipients had passed away over the decades. Page was the final living connection to those battles. With his death, the last eyewitness to what happened on Henderson Field was gone. Page was buried with full military honors at Riverside National Cemetery in Riverside, California. Marines in dress blue uniforms carried his casket. A firing party fired 3 volleys. A bugler played taps. The flag that covered his casket was folded and presented to his family. Hundreds of Marines attended the funeral. They came to honor a man who had defined what it meant to be a Marine. They came to honor someone who had held the line when holding the line seemed impossible. The official citation for Page's Medal of Honor describes his actions in formal military language. It states that he continued to direct the fire of his gunners until all his men were either killed or wounded. It states that he fought alone against the deadly hail of Japanese shells. It states that he moved from gun to gun, never ceasing his withering fire against the advancing hordes until reinforcements finally arrived. Then it states that he dauntlessly and aggressively led a bayonet charge, driving the enemy back and preventing a breakthrough in our lines. These words describe what happened, but they do not explain why it mattered. They do not explain what Henderson Field meant to the Pacific War. They do not explain what would have happened if Page had stopped fighting. They do not explain the strategic consequences of one Marine holding one ridge for 6 hours. Henderson Field was the only operational American airfield in the Solomon Islands in October 1942. Without it, American bombers could not reach Japanese supply convoys. Without those bombers, Japan could reinforce and resupply their forces throughout the Pacific. The Japanese understood this. That is why they committed 7,000 troops to retaking the airfield. That is why they accepted catastrophic casualties trying to break through the Marine perimeter. Henderson Field was worth any price. If Page's sector had collapsed on October 26th, the Japanese would have reached the airfield. They would have destroyed the bombers and fighters parked there. They would have captured the fuel dumps and ammunition stores. The Marines would have been forced to evacuate. Guadalcanal would have remained under Japanese control. The first American offensive in the Pacific would have failed. The strategic implications extend beyond Guadalcanal. American war planners based their entire Pacific strategy on controlling key islands and using those islands as air bases for further advances. Guadalcanal was the test case. If the strategy failed at Guadalcanal, it would be abandoned. The Pacific War would have taken a completely different course. The timeline for defeating Japan would have extended by years. Thousands of additional American lives would have been lost. This is what one Marine prevented by refusing to abandon his position. This is what 33 Marines died protecting. This is why their sacrifice mattered so profoundly to the outcome of World War II. Mitchell Page understood this. He understood that October 26, 1942, was not just about holding a ridge or defending an airfield. It was about 32 Marines whose names most people would never know. It was about men who did their duty and died doing it. It was about making sure their deaths accomplished something meaningful. That is why he kept fighting when fighting should have been impossible. That is why he led a bayonet charge when charging was suicide. That is why he spent decades after the war protecting the honor of Medal of Honor recipients. Because honor was all those 32 Marines had left. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about machine gunners and platoon sergeants who held impossible positions with courage and training. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Mitchell Page and those 32 Marines don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.